Today we're going to talk about different modifiers in our modifier list and how they can change basic shapes or editable polys, editable mesh, anything that we create, how those modifiers can adjust them. So what I'll do is I'll come into my standard primitives and I'm just going to create maybe a rectangle. And maybe for what some of the things that we'll do, we'll give it some length segments, some height segments, and some width segments. So from here, let's just take a look at some of the modifiers and just to see what they can do. Let's start with maybe a bend modifier. Okay, so the bend modifier, what it allows us to do is bend our mesh. We can kind of rotate our mesh from the top and bottom, which is another kind of bending. We can choose what axis we want to happen. So let's look at some of these. So maybe I want to bend it at a 90-degree angle. And we can already see with what we have under angle 90 degrees and our bend axis is the z-axis, the up axis, we can already see what's going on. If we change this angle, we'll see that our mesh also changes. And to do that, all I did was went over to my up and down arrow. I just clicked my mouse and held it, and then I can just move my mouse up and down to change the value. Maybe we can change the direction of it also, or the bend axis. So here on the y-axis, if we change those, we can see what it's doing. In the x-axis, and again with our direction, how we want it to do. So this is one of those, a lot of the modifiers are really, really fun to play with, and we can get an understanding of how they work when we play around with them. Okay, so we have a bend modifier that bends. Okay, let's see if we can create another shape, and let's see what else we can play with real quick. Maybe a cylinder. What modifier do we want to look at now? We do have the Editable Poly and Edit Poly and Edit Mesh that will allow you to take an object as if you had converted it to an editable poly or an editable mesh, but it's still up in our stack. So if we wanted to come down and change an object or something about the object, we can, and then go back to the Editable Poly. And we will have a video that goes over Edit Poly. There's a lot of information to go over, so I don't want to cover that in this video since we're just taking a look at basic modifiers. So let's see, what other modifier can we play with? We have a melt modifier. What it allows us to do is to kind of make our object look like it's melting. And we can infer from the name what it does. So if I have, I'm going to turn on my auto key so I can key my attributes, and maybe over frame 100 we want our object to melt. So we can see we're kind of melting. Do we want it to melt like ice or maybe glass? Which kind of look like the same, jelly, plastic. And I believe that these values are how quickly they melt. Anytime that we see this red box over something, that means that the key has been animated or that we have some kind of attribute that's animated. So we can come in and maybe change our percent of melt. We make that higher or even lower. And along the way we can change whatever we want. Okay, so we have a melt modifier. Let's see what else we can play with. Turbosmooth is one. Turbosmooth, mesh smooth, they do kind of the same thing in that they create more geometry. So let's go to Turbosmooth. What Turbosmooth does is it tries to smooth edges and adds geometry, as we can see, and we can choose how many iterations we want it to smooth to. So right here we have one iteration. If we changed it to 2, 3, 4, it's adding a lot more polygons. So if I do my statistics, default is 7 on our keyboard, or we can, I believe, come to perspective, and we have, no, we can come to configure statistics. Right. It's creating a lot more geometry, and we can see how many more polygons are created if we go to our statistics. The keyboard shortcut is 7, and here we can see now we have 202,000 polygons, or 101,000 verts. But if I lower the iterations, we can see that my polygon and vertex count is also lowering. And this can be used for if we have a mesh that we want to look smoother. So for example, if I have that bend modifier on there and I choose to add a Turbosmooth as well, then it's going to smooth the mesh that I already have. And let's make one more. There's one more little neat one I'd like to show. So I'm going to do a plane, and I'm going to add some length segments and width segments, so maybe like 50 each. So we've got quite a good number of polygons. Then I'm going to show you how the order that we have our modifiers can change how it looks. So I'm going to do a noise modifier. So I have a noise modifier, and I'm going to scale down. I'm going to do strength on the z-axis up. And we can see that my noise modifier is starting to affect my mesh. If I continue with that scale. Okay. So we have kind of like a wavy look. And then I'm going to add a push modifier. And what a push modifier does is it's going to either push or pull these vertices closer together. So if I do a positive, it's going to make them balloon out or push them further apart. Or if I do a negative value, it will make them kind of squeeze closer together. So now I have kind of like a water type effect. And I can change that noise modifier and animate my noise using my phase. If I were to come in and change this to maybe 10, so it looks a little bit slower, and I can see that I'm animating my water. Let's make that a little bit bigger, so we'll see some bigger changes. Maybe we'll take that back to a 100. We can see my noise modifier and my push modifier working together. If I change them though, we can see that they look a lot different, because my push modifier, if I turn this one off so we can't see it, it's not really doing anything to my vertices on this plane, but my noise modifier is still manipulating my verts. So I'm going to pull that back down, change my order, and now we can see, again, we have kind of that water looking effect. So that's a neat one you can play around with. And so, again, for the third time, I would advise you to play around with a lot of these modifiers. You can get some really neat things, and there's some modifiers that we'll be looking at specifically, like skin and whatnot, in later videos, because they do specific things, but a lot of them play well together. So play around with those and have a lot of fun.